Mossad involvement. Everyone is, a lot of people are talking about this being a Mossad, an Israeli play for an end game that involves dividing up Syria completely into three parts. How can we ever have any certain knowledge on these claims? What do you know about that?
I think that if you look at where Israel stands, Israel does not want a strong Syria. It doesn't want Assad to be entirely in control, but doesn't want the rebels to take over Syria either. So I think that it is legitimate to say that Israel would want to see Assad in trouble, but it is also legitimate to say that that has no bearing on the Syrians' desire for freedom. Because what Israel wants is that there is a stalemate between the rebels and Bashar al-Assad. And given that it was two in favor of Assad, it is true that there may be a case to be made that the Israelis would like to see the rebels push Assad back to a 50-50. So if someone wants to argue that Mossad is watching the rebel advance on Aleppo and on Hama and doesn't mind that advance, there is an argument to be made for that. But I don't think that that affects the Syrian legitimacy in terms of demanding the liberation of Damascus, because I think that what the UAE are pitching to the Americans and the Israelis is that yes, Assad is being pushed back, but you don't want Assad to fall. And I think where Israel is concerned is, okay, they're marching, but a bit too rapidly for my liking. They're marching a bit too fast, and Assad is falling a bit too easily for my liking. So right now, I'm happy to watch Assad lose. But if they march on Damascus, I might intervene to rescue Assad. Israel's interest is not in the rebels or in Bashar al-Assad. It's in the stalemate itself. And that's why I think that when people say that Assad was the bastion against the Israelis and Israel wants to see Assad fall, I don't think the Israelis want to see Assad fall at all. They want to see him weak. They don't want to see him fall. I don't think that Saudi Arabia or UAE, Israel's allies in the region, at least UAE, which has normalized ties, and the views expressed on my own don't reflect anybody else. But in any case, the idea that they don't want to see Assad fall as well is because they're aware if Assad falls, it will cause a domino effect that will hurt the regimes and hurt Israel too. And that's why I don't think necessarily Mossad is working with the Syrian rebels. I think more that Israel has an immediate interest in seeing Assad weakened, but no interest in seeing him defeated. And I think that's where people sometimes get confused. They assume that support for the Syrian rebels means you're supporting the Israelis. No, that's not true. Supporting the liberation of Syria is what the Israelis are terrified of. And I do think that when you look at the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, and again, this is speculation, but I think the timing of the ceasefire and the humiliating terms that Hezbollah accepted, which is the idea of allowing the Israelis to enter Lebanon whenever they wish, terms that they weren't willing to accept beforehand, I think it does have a lot to do with the idea that Hezbollah realized Syria is in trouble and Syria is the greater priority than Gaza. The idea of establishing that Shia crescent that goes from Iran to Lebanon is the greater priority. So make a deal with the Israelis and go and save Syria. And I do think that the Erdogan, he didn't act on Gaza, but he's acting on Syria. I think because from Erdogan's perspective, and indeed Saudi, and indeed many in the region, Iran is currently perceived as the greater threat because of what it did in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. And ignore what that might mean when you put Iran and Israel in the same bracket. The reason people say that is, and this is the point, people often say that Syria is in a mess because Israel and the Americans and the Western powers conspired against Syria. This is a half-truth. It's a half-truth because after the 67 war in 1973, the Americans and the Israelis believed that there needed to be a dismantling of the Iraqi army, the Syria army, and the Egyptian army. Americans began to donate heavily to the Egyptian army and to train them in order to keep them focused more on their people than on outside, and they succeeded in that. Iraqi army, they went in, they brought down Saddam Hussein, and they destroyed the Iraqi army, and now you've seen it's all militias that are roaming around in Iraq itself. And in Syria, indeed, I do think that the Israelis and the Americans want to see the Syrian army destroyed. That's a half-truth. The other side of the truth is that none of the Israeli or US machinations are possible in Syria without the oppression of the Assad family. Ibn Khaldun says, Al-adlu asasul mulk. Justice is the foundation of all dominion. وَالظُّلْمُ مُؤْذِنٌ بِخَرَابِ الْعُمْرَانِ. Oppression is what destroys the civilization. We have famous stories in Islamic history. Umar bin Abdul Aziz radiallahu ta'ala was sent a letter by his governor who said to him, I've got unruly tribes in my area. I need you to send more forces for me to hassinha, to fortify it and keep it under control. Umar Abdul Aziz responded and said, you don't need more forces. Hassinha bil adl. Fortify it with justice. Fortify it by giving people their legitimate desires. And that's why it's a half truth that Israel and America are conspiring against Syria. It's a half truth that Israel doesn't like Assad. It's a half truth that Israel perhaps is happy to see Assad reeling, even if it doesn't want him defeated. But the other side of the truth is that it's the dhulm in Syria itself that allowed the window for these international powers to come out. And I give you an example in not so recent time, in a recent time, 2016, when the army tried a coup on Erdogan. Why were the army unable to do a coup on Erdogan? Because the people took to the streets. They took to the bridges, they took to the streets, and they said, we will not allow you to topple Erdogan because he built the southern cities, he renovated them, he built the roads, he built the hospitals, there was a famous poll after the earthquakes in eastern Turkey. Who do you blame for the destruction of the buildings? They said Erdogan. Who do you trust to rebuild it? Erdogan. Erdogan built a record whereby the people genuinely saw him as somebody who builds. Ignore whatever grievances we have over his foreign policy. Assad's dhulm is what led Syria and ripped Syria apart, because الظلم مؤذن بخراب العمر. And that's why when people say we need Assad to stay in power to facilitate Palestinians' liberation, I argue differently. We need justice in Syria to liberate Palestine. Assad has failed in delivering that justice. That oppression needs to go quickly so that we can create an environment of some justice or reconciliation so we can focus on liberation of Palestine, which is why Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi goes to Syria and Egypt first before he's able to go and liberate Al-Aqsa afterwards.
I mean, we can also ask the question, we just had war in Gaza, and Assad had Syria. Yeah. Where was the help, right? We literally had a live demonstration over almost 2 years now, and the impact was negligible, right? So that argument is going to be weak, that we need him to help with Israel.
Hey, yes, no, entirely. It's very true. And also, when you look at Assad's position, the reality is that, you know, there are reports coming out suggesting that the deal that the Americans want to offer Assad is abandon the Iranians and we'll come in and rescue your regime as well. Assad is able to be useful to all of the international powers. He's able to shift and align. If Iranians are angry with him, he goes to the Russians. Russians are angry with him, he's able to recognize with Bin Salman. Bin Salman is angry with him, he's able to talk to the Americans and say, I need you to fight against terrorism. And this is why people who are saying that we need Bashar al-Assad, the reality is they are accepting for themselves what they would not, they're accepting for others what they would not accept for themselves. And here is the tragic irony. And here I talk about those from the Shia who support Bashar al-Assad. The Shia tell the story of Sayyidina al-Hussein, radiallahu ta'ala an, going against Yazid, who they say is a dictator and a tyrant, and they say this story about somebody who valued the freedom and justice of the Muslims so much that he sacrificed himself against the brutal dictator Yazid. How is it that in Syria they flipped it the opposite way, where those who are much more similar to Sayyidina al-Hussein going out and marching for the sake of justice, for freedom, for righteousness, how have they mistook Bashar for al-Hussein and Yazid and made him the rebels, when in reality the story logically should be implemented in the opposite way? Yeah. And that's why I'm not the sectarian in terms of calling, you know, this is against anti-Shia. I'm saying to those who believe in the Shia thought, if you look carefully at your books, if you look carefully at your story, you will find that Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala and al-Hussein and al-Hassan, all of those from Ahl al-Bayt, in my opinion, their stories resemble much more closely the Syrians fighting against Assad than Assad fighting against the Syrians themselves. 100%. And that's why I think even as we talk to, you know, the Shia groups and the like, it's important that we talk about it from the door of da'wah, that guys, you know, Assad is not as good as you think it is. And I think a lot of it, and I finish on this point, I think a lot of the support for Bashar al-Assad that comes from the Shia is out of fear of what Sunnis will do to them afterwards, out of fear of some sort of vengeance. It's almost Zionist in the sense of, we're not going to leave Israel because if these Palestinians come in, they will do this to us, they will do that to us. It's like when you talk to a Jew, I sympathize with the Palestinians, but imagine what they will do to us because of what we did to them. And that's why I think that a lot of the hysteria in Shia support for Bashar al-Assad can be rectified, can be pushed back against with a bit of da'wah, using even some of their own books to highlight that what they celebrate is in the Syrian rebels, and what they hate, what they preach, what they hate is in Bashar al-Assad.
That's a great point. And also Assad he's not even managing his own country, let alone helping and facing a huge enemy like Israel. He's a incompetent dictator. Hafiz al-Assad was a competent, evil dictator. No one messed around in Syria except him. No one oppressed in Syria except him. Today, everyone's meddling in Syria. There are so many hands in Syria, just indicating his pure incompetence as an evil dictator. He's a sloppy, evil dictator that can't even manage his own home and his own country.